Cecilia Frobisher spent much of her Sunday doing what she had done the day before, which involved plenty of investigation concerning a potion and very little concerning the potion she was supposed to be working on. She had risen early. Remus had returned to the cottage in the early hours of the morning, and as he slipped into bed next to her she was roused from her dream. Remus had fallen to sleep almost immediately, as he always did on nights such as those, and Cecilia had lain awake next to him for some time, listening to his breathing become deeper and more restful, knowing that the tolls of whatever the evening had brought him were being soothed away with the anesthesia of sleep. Then Cecilia had slipped out of the covers and, pulling on her dressing gown as her beloved's sighs of contented rest turned into indistinguishable muttering, made her way quietly downstairs through the living room and into the kitchen. Making herself a cup of tea, which involved boiling tap water in a copper kettle on the cooking range and then pouring the hot water over the tea leaves which Remus had helpfully removed from the tea bags when she had bought them on her last trip to Ambleside, Cecilia sat in the peaceful solitude of the kitchen, watching the sun illuminate the kitchen's tiled floor as its embryonic rays crept through the living room window. Peace and quiet was what she needed at the moment, aside from the guilt that she had lurking in a mental cul-de-sac at her near abandonment of the potion that she was supposed to be redeveloping for Harry with Snape. The letter that had arrived the day before from Snape had made the feeling more acute. Cecilia felt almost unmotivated by it following her discussion of her plans with Sirius. It was as if her inner torch was now illuminating this new mystery, and her mind was straining at the leash like an excitable puppy in her childlike urgency to discover. Yes, Cecilia concluded to herself wryly, Sirius. Perhaps if he had laughed at her when she had told him about her plan, belittled her and called her naive in the guise of a half-joke as was his manner, Cecilia knew that she would have put the idea of developing a cure for Remus's lycanthropy to the back of her mind. And perhaps she would have dismissed them long ago had it not been for the notes that were in her possession. However, they had come to be mixed up in the back of her notes that Snape had returned to her a few days ago. Cecilia neither knew nor cared. What she did care about was the apparent claim that they had appeared to suggest. The situation she had shared tentatively with Sirius had been tame and weak compared to what the notes appeared to actually claim, and this is why she had spent most of Saturday working secretly on it. No more cloak and dagger stuff for me, she told Sirius. But this wasn't deception, rather the beginnings of a new adventure. She sipped at her tea thoughtfully as she pondered the origin of the notes. It wasn't as if she hadn't actually considered the content of the pages. She wouldn't be Cecilia Frobisher if she hadn't, and just as she knew she had never seen them before, Cecilia assumed they must have come from Hogwarts at the time when the school's teachers had contributed to her bank of knowledge to replace what she had lost to the wand of Draco Malfoy. They were detailed to the point of fastidiousness, and had she not been familiar with Snape's robust lettering that had persistently nestled on an infuriatingly regular basis next to her own scrawl, she would have sworn they were his. What did the notes entail then? Had the author known what they were writing, and what was their purpose for doing so? There was nothing explicit laid down in the parchment, which Cecilia was resisting from going to fetch from the stack of ephemera that was still piled on the floor of the utility room, yet the sentences, written in note form that suggested they had been compiled over several intervals rather than in one go, were the careful observations of werewolf behavior in marvelous detail. What made her think that the tangle of ideas that were laid out in fascinating detail meant anything, though? Cecilia swirled her increasingly cooling drink around as she deliberated over the implications of not only her possession of them but also setting on a course of action based on what they detailed. If she had been someone else who was attempting this and Cecilia had been asked her opinion, then she would probably advise this someone else that it was a waste of time, which was one of the many reasons why she had not questioned the content of the parchments with Dumbledore, Minerva or Snape. And to some extent she was taking advantage of her situation with respect to the time she had available, her solitude and available resources. But when it came down to it, Cecilia knew that she loved Remus Lupin with all of her heart. How could she do anything other than try to at least see whether what these pages seemed to be telling her was true? Turning her almost empty cup around in her hands, Cecilia watched the dregs of tea circle around the bottom as she wondered whether she should have shared her secret with Sirius, and, as she thought about it, she decided she was glad she had, even if it was just for peace of mind. Sirius was Remus's best friend, and in spite, or because of, their past history, she was keen to have him know that she had his best friend's happiness at heart. Her thoughts drifted back, as she got to her feet to refill her teacup with now brewed tea, to a day ago when she had been making breakfast in that very kitchen, and about the information she had received in exchange for her own confidence. As much as she wanted to talk at length about what Sirius had told her with Remus when he finally arose at around tea time, Cecilia found that she was actually having trouble understanding it herself. She had promised not to share it with anyone in any case, but that Sirius had asked her opinion had been the overriding reason as to why she could not forget about it. Instead, Cecilia's mind filled up and began to weigh heavily again with the unresolved possibilities and implications. He had said that Voldemort had used powerful magic to split his soul. If we are talking about energy and science in the context of the universal link, then yes, that was possible. Energy could certainly alter the mind, and it wasn't outside the realms of possibility that sufficiently efficient energy is produced by a powerful spell could allow a breakup of some kind and possibly a transferal to another location. Even if she was ignorant of her own theory, then it was clear from her own witness that Voldemort could exist without an intact soul, and that he had existed quite well indeed. Cecilia swallowed quickly at the now tan and concentrated tea that she had just imbibed as a doubt crossed her mind. Why had Sirius imparted the information to her? He had told her it had something to do with his brother, and that these Horcruxes, the objects the parts of the soul were put into. Why had he wanted her assistance? And then it dawned on Cecilia. Perhaps in the same way that she had confided in him as Remus's friend, Sirius had told her a little about his brother for the same reason. To make amends and to silently tell her that all was now well between them. With renewed vigor and a glow in her stomach at her happy revelation, Cecilia glanced towards the utility room as she got to her feet and made her way to her research. Remus would be up soon and leaving for his work with the Order, and however tempted she was to turn back to the other research, she didn't want to run the risk of discovery. Around the small utility room the sunlight had begun to grow in its intensity, and it reflected off the glassware that she had used to create the last batch of potion, its rays glinting off the backwash that still remained in the bottom of the flask. As she began the process of cleaning her glassware, Cecilia began to wrestle with a sluggish thought that groaned with underuse in the back of her mind as she forced her mindset into a particular vein. Picking up the flask to begin with, Cecilia began to rinse it out under a small tap that was fixed on the external wall of the utility room and dropped directly into a drain below it. What was annoying her with Harry's potion at the moment, Cecilia pondered as she swirled for the third time fresh spring water around the rotund piece of glassware, was her limited knowledge base. When she worked on it the first time, she had had access to the Hogwarts library, and even though she had found very little, the very act of carrying out research had allowed for the relevant information to click into place. Well, there was very little that could be done about that, concluded Cecilia as she returned the flask to its cork ring before beginning to dismantle the reflux condenser from its stand. She would have to use what she already knew and understand to make a bold leap of faith into the unknown and commit herself to a path based on scant knowledge. The removal of the congealed potion around the lip of the condenser, however, was abandoned as Cecilia flitted from its cleanliness to the drawer in the wooden bench, or more specifically to the notebook that she had abandoned with equal suddenness a couple of days ago. She took up a pen and began to outline the concepts that made up the new theory about the continuum of wizards with respect to their magical abilities. Their main theory was that how much of a wizard you are in terms of how well you could metabolize energy to make magic is a continuum. That is, It is not one determined factor, and where you fall on a range that varied from no magical ability to high magical ability was determined to various degrees by a birth, and in particular the existence of a W gene which was present in the wizard samples and that of Petunia Dursley, and the existence of other complementary genes that enhanced ability, b your environment, which could be altered, as seen by Henrietta Edwards and her decision to give up her powers, and c to your predisposition, emotions and strength of feeling and willpower. It was the combination of these factors that determined how magical a wizard or witch was, and why there was a variety of strength of power. It was why, with much empathy and assistance, Squibs could still operate in the wizard world, and why, she supposed, that a so-called mule as Petunia Dursley must have such strong feelings against wizards that she had allowed her feelings to mask, or even detriment her abilities. Of course, the latter was only a hypothesis, and it would take more research to prove whether this was true. However, Snape also believed it to be true, which reinforced her own belief. But where to progress from here? And how did this fit into the making of Harry's potion? Putting down her pen, Cecilia made her slippered way across to the tap again and proceeded to work on removing the encrusted potion from its rim. She couldn't be certain to how it would fit together, not yet. Not until she knew the results of Snape's work using spells, and then he would hopefully respond to her theory about Petunia Dursley, which she had outlined in her last letter to her colleague. And she would have to wait, Cecilia thought dryly as she took up the clean flask and began to fill it with ingredients that would be her first rough practice at manufacturing the Wolfsbane potion, which she had surmised yesterday that would be the start of her lycanthropy cure. Her premise was based on theory, and further research was limited through the lack of connection to resources. Tearing the herbs to create a smaller surface area, Cecilia's mind drifted back to Remus. Although he usually slept during this time in the month for a good many hours, he had slept up until the early evening the day before, and she had had to wake him when it got dark for him to take his potion. He had reassured her he was just tired from an exciting foray with Sirius, and he had continued to sleep in his wolf form before the wood-burning fire, his torso moving in and out, as his paws flicked sporadically. From her vantage point, with her legs over one arm of a chair, Cecilia had pondered what his lupine dreams consisted of, likening them to dog dreams where they are chasing their prey, and it wasn't until she had given her forebrain a kick and asked herself rhetorically exactly what quarry a werewolf might be pursuing that she halted that train of thought, changed platforms and boarded another, destination lupinism cure. She had then spent a good few hours as she planned her new exciting scientific adventure, watching him for a time as she read through her new notes as he transformed into his human form, lying, fully clothed on the thick pile rug in front of the spent embers of the fire before retiring to her night's slumber. It had been early that morning when Remus had joined her there. Once Cecilia had the ingredients of the potion simmering quietly under efflux over a camping gas burner. As the light began to stream in more boldly through the window, she pulled her notes back out of the bench drawer as she began to think about the theory surrounding her manufacture of the lycanthropy cure that her mysterious notes alluded to, and for the first time since she had made the decision to investigate it, Cecilia began to feel doubtful. Of course she couldn't actually make the potion. She was a mole after all and could make the blend of potions as best as she could, and she would need Snape's skillful assistance in order for its magical properties to avail themselves. And then to tell Remus, and hope. All she had was hope. A foolish hope. And then a great crash in the kitchen, a whooping which sounded as if something had collided with the wall, and the sound of the living room door slamming brought Cecilia back down to earth and caused her to drop her notebook onto the large grey flagstones as she hurried to see what was going on. "Morning, love," said Remus as he looked at her sheepishly. "I was too late for the owl," and he crashed. On the floor in front of them lay a large, once majestic tawny owl, thrown onto its back. It fluttered and whooped in alarm as the shock of its impact into the window was finally dawning on it. Cecilia looked at the damaged window frame where it was clear that the bird had been trying to get through and where Remus had been too slow to allow it to glide gracefully in through the open window. "Fenestra reparo," added Remus, shaking his head, and the broken pane of glass and splintered wood of the frame leapt back into place. Then he followed Cecilia's gaze and he added, "They're used to it. He'll be all right in a few minutes." "So, a cup of tea?" asked Cecilia as she stepped past the owl's prostrate form on their kitchen floor as it struggled to its feet. "Toast?" Remus shook his head and she realized he was holding a letter. "For you or me?" she continued, filling up the copper kettle with water again. "Me," said Remus, making his way over to the kitchen table and taking a seat. "Dumbledore," he added as she continued to look at him while she washed her cup under the kitchen tap. "It's good of him to send you your work by owl," commented Cecilia when Remus hadn't replied, and, as he hadn't replied about her offer of tea and toast, she made both, placing the cup and plate in front of him. Sitting down on the chair opposite, she realized that, at 7:30 on a Sunday morning, he was already dressed in his work clothes. "So, are you going to be back for tea?" asked Cecilia as Remus continued to read the letter. "Or shall I do you breakfast again?" "What? Oh, no. Yes. I'll be back early evening," said Remus brightly, breaking off from his letter from Dumbledore and placing it on the table. "I'll need my potion this evening anyway, and it'll probably be the last night. The fire's preferable this evening," he added as he looked at Cecilia, and he broke off as the letter on the kitchen table exploded into a purple fireball before evaporating before their eyes. "He really wants to make sure," commented Cecilia, smiling back at Remus as she extended her hand across the table. "I'm glad you'll be back," she added as he got to his feet and she rose too, walking over to the window and opening it so the post owl could fly back through it and out onto the rest of its deliveries. "And you, off back to bed," he chided mildly as Cecilia smiled guiltily. "I know you probably waited until I transformed before going to bed last night and you were up at the crack of dawn." Looking past her at the pile of paper over the utility room floor, he shook his head. "Once I've tidied," she added as Remus pulled her closer and she hugged him as he kissed the top of her hair before disapparating. And so, because of her famine of sleep that previous night, Cecilia was in bed when she heard a crack downstairs which woke her up with a start and had proceeded to pull on her dressing gown around her and hold it together. She had lost the tie, as she yawned her way downstairs. Before promptly turning back, now more awake, and hurrying back into their bedroom to dress properly for a visit from Severus Snape. Through a haze of ebbing tiredness, Cecilia had begun to have a long discourse with Snape as they sat together in the cottage's sitting room, about the science related to the universal link which she had outlined in her letter. He chided her for working too late, telling her that they would not make efficient gains if she became a slave to it, and Cecilia felt a stab of guilt at her dereliction of duty that day and the day before when she had focused rebelliously in the possible lycanthropy cure. There was just one more day to go, Snape informed her, changing the subject swiftly to Cecilia's relief, before school recommenced, and he wanted to make sure he had all of the contacts and information correct before the monotony and banality of teaching began. To hear him describe teaching in such a manner, Cecilia felt sorry for him. To her, even when she was at her most tired and worn down from problems, delays, lack of effective productivity and fussy children, it was always a great joy. Because she didn't want a pedagogical argument with him, however, she changed the subject again. "Would you care for a cup of tea?" she asked, getting to her feet. "I'm afraid I've no milk." "Remus doesn't care for it." "Oh." Cecilia broke off as Snape magicked a tray of tea and biscuits onto a small tray, and she was reminded of the first time she had seen him flourish his wand to produce a tea tray similar to this in Dumbledore's portable study when they had first met, almost a year ago in Grimmauld Place. "Thanks," she said graciously, returning to her seat and taking up a cup which, she noted, he had remembered to leave black. "I know this is a strange question," she continued as Snape sipped silently at his own tea. "Why is it that Voldemort pursues Harry so relentlessly? Why does he want to kill him when there are surely other ways he could come to power?" Mid-biscuit, Snape turned slowly to look at her, his face firm, before swallowing his mouthful of custard cream and looking at her intently. "Cecilia," he began, turning to face her and looking at her solemnly, and Cecilia wondered whether she had ever seen his expression so grave. She lowered her hand that was holding her teacup and sat still, waiting for him to continue, and the wizard leaned towards her, though there was no affection in his gesture. "The way you think around things. That is not the manner in which Lord Voldemort thinks. To him the dent to his powerful pride is Potter's existence, as predicted in the prophecy." "The prophecy?" repeated Cecilia quietly. "Which is what, exactly?" "That. I cannot disclose, Cecilia. It is between Potter and Professor Dumbledore. But the point remains, the Dark Lord will not abide any to live that have challenged him, whether unconsciously or deliberately. Now," he continued, turning his head towards the kitchen door as his tone lightened, "perhaps we should continue with our discussion. You have your research notes." He trailed off as he watched Cecilia rise to her feet before making her way into the kitchen. Not a minute later she was handing over her notebook, absent of lycanthropy research or the original notes, and for a further hour they discussed science and magic, making progress in terms of hypotheses and plans of action. At his insistence, she and Snape covered the basics of science again, although it was clear to Cecilia that was not necessary. In addition, his understanding, analysis and conclusive skills for work around upper A-level standard, which was required to understand the fundamentals and subtleties of the universal link, were astonishing, and through an ever-diminishing haze Cecilia wondered why he needed to check with her at all. "Therefore it would seem necessary that my work should encompass the investigation of DNA," Snape concluded, folding together her recent notebook. "If we agree there is a continuum, then it would seem likely that there are other genes that influence how wizard-like a wizard is. How far he is powerful, adept, astute." He handed the book back to Cecilia before getting to his feet. "You understand how controversial this is to wizard kind?" Cecilia stared back at him vacantly, clearly defying his assumption. "The investigation of blood, which is sacred to wizards, was frowned upon even by Dumbledore himself," he continued, beginning to tread over the cottage's well-worn carpet towards the large picture window that lay at the end of the living room, his shadow from the early evening sun lengthening in its direction. "To declare that magical powers can be determined through a random assortment of genes, biological. Not born of the magical essence within a wizard, the soul, by the chance assembly of protein molecules is. Abhorrent." He turned round swiftly, shouting the word sharply across the room, and fixed her with a stare. "To wizards. A majority verdict would declare it so," he clarified, before looking away. She felt her face soften as she began to realize how important it was to him that she understood. Snape looked back at her again, and Cecilia got to her feet. "Yes," she nodded, ignoring the spark that Snape's mention of wizards' souls had stirred in the back of her mind, but she forced the mental door of her mind shut lest in Snape's comfortable company she betrayed the trust that was put in her a day ago. "I see now that—" Cecilia broke off again as self-consciousness pricked under her thorax and she changed the subject. Nick Smith. The mole man who so graciously donated his equipment. Snape looked towards the kitchen door. Cecilia nodded. "I wish to test more samples, from others, to cross-reference our results," he continued. "We have time, barely time but enough to carry out further analysis. If we wish the potion to be safe and effective for Harry," nodded Cecilia, finishing Snape's sentence with annoying accuracy. "I understand. Of course, your absence at Hogwarts has made further work on my part necessary," he continued, folding his arms. "If you conceded to return to Hogwarts." Cecilia closed her eyes in a slow blink, before returning his look of determination with one of her own. When I returned home, though I knew roughly about genetic biology, Nick Smith more than helped us, as I knew he would. He allowed me to test the samples then, and he has extended his offer now. He works, Severus, at a nuclear energy production company roughly 50 miles west from here, by the coast, although you'll be no better off speaking to Tunks. She smiled warmly, contrasting to Snape's own impassive expression. You can replace my assistance easy enough with as much effort as you are putting in to entice me back to Hogwarts, she added, with finality. You belong at Hogwarts, replied Snape bluntly, advancing on Cecilia like a rock descending on its prey, speaking as if he hadn't heard anything she'd just said, and for a split second she thought he was about to seize her arms in his outstretched hands. Instead, watching Cecilia sink to the chair below her, he curled them closed and fell silent. We've been through this, Severus, sighed Cecilia, looking down at the patterned print of her skirt before looking back to him, speaking honestly to her colleague and friend. I would dearly, dearly love to return, to make sure that the potion is right for Harry. I mean, we've been talking about a spectrum of ability, which might have consequences for everything we've done. She trailed off, hoping that Snape would nod in confirmation as she gestured towards her notes. When he did so, she continued. Naturally you want to make sure that Harry's safe, I understand that. But I'm here. With Remus. Where I need to be. He needs me. He's got no one else. We're just going to have to make do with what. Cecilia broke off suddenly as a loud bang came from the kitchen, making her jump, and her shocked expression turned into a smile as Remus Lupin opened the adjoining door into the living room. Cecilia Remus began as she took a step towards him, taking in his fraught appearance and demeanor, but his gaze drew a line from her face to the immobile form of Snape. Lupin, intoned Snape as Remus closed the door behind him and stepped past Cecilia, hovering in front of her. Snape, he returned, what were you discussing? He stared back at Snape, folding his arms, and Cecilia placed a hand on his arm. We were talking about, she began, gesturing towards her notes on the coffee table. Cecilia's return to Hogwarts, finished Snape, continuing to return Remus's stare. Which I have told Severus is out of the question, she reinforced, folding her arms as Remus turned to look at her. Indeed, said Remus to Snape, taking a step towards Cecilia. Then he turned to her, his hostile expression softening a little. Have you got everything sorted out that you needed to? Cecilia glanced across at Snape. Not really, she thought. You arrived before we had had a chance to arrange anything. Remus followed her gaze again, and Cecilia abandoned her search for choice words to describe this when Snape nodded stiffly. Not quite, darling, replied Cecilia, touching his arm softly as he continued to stare at Snape, and she felt him flinch under her touch. A few minutes more and we will have. The next half an hour was painful. Remus returned to the kitchen, leaving Cecilia and Snape to finish off their work in the living room, although he was clearly not happy doing so. Every so often a bump or a crash diffused into the living room, and Cecilia was sure he was attempting to prepare dinner without using magic. At the same time, Cecilia had been trying to conclude her work with Snape with increasingly desperate rapidity, but if the wizard had any intention of leaving in a hurry, he wasn't showing it. Indeed, he seemed even more physically stoical than he had done earlier. Then Remus re-entered the living room, pacing around and gazing wistfully out of the window, saying nothing before eventually, Snape folded her research notebook closed, handing it to Cecilia before making his way towards him. Spectacular view, he commented, looking in the vague direction of Remus's stare. Very quiet and off the beaten track. Whereas you return to the hustle and bustle of school, commented Remus, turning sharply and narrowing his eyes. Where one can disguise questionable actions with the greatest of ease. Before Cecilia's eyes, Snape made to step towards Lupin, his body tense and immobile. Then, he turned back towards Cecilia. If there's anything else, Mrs. Frobisher, he said, looking at her intently again. You can owl me. Or send a note with Lupin, or speak to me at the next order meeting. I'll be resigning, she said, smiling reassuringly at Remus. Snape said nothing, but nodded once, stiffly. Your presence and contribution there will be missed, he added, and Cecilia felt herself wanting to ask Severus Snape what it was he wanted to say as she watched Remus pad softly across the living room carpet, coming to rest next to her. I can owl you, Cecilia confirmed as Remus took her by the hand, and now, seeing his face reflected in the early evening glow that was irradiating the room, she noticed for the first time his haggard and gaunt expression. It was lovely seeing you, she added, glancing away from Remus before looking between the two wizards who were now both openly glaring at one another. Snape broke eye contact first, nodding at Cecilia before disapparating. It was only when he had gone that Remus bared his pained expression bodily, slumping heavily onto the settee and staring at the carpet. I didn't know he was coming, Remus, Cecilia began, sitting next to him and taking his hand. She held it firmer when he didn't curl his own back, as he usually did before looking up at her, momentarily through narrowing eyes issuing immediate doubt at her words, before slumping further back, allowing his head to touch the stitched rest at the top of the cushions. Cecilia continued to hold his hand, remaining quiet for a time as he stared straight ahead, before tentatively asking, "What's wrong, love?" Remus turned from an imaginary spot on the dulled flowery wallpaper above the fireplace to look at Cecilia, and she had to swallow down a gasp when she saw his expression. I knew they'd find out eventually, he sighed, holding her hand tighter now as he sighed the words in her direction, and Cecilia's heart gave a brief flutter of joy that he was not angry at her before its wings were clipped with the resignation in his voice. The Werewolf Code. And Remus began to slowly reveal to Cecilia how he had been summoned to the Ministry to give testimony under a new security law, detailing his possible breaking of the code, how his name had appeared in the reports sent to the Ministry, and his actions on the night of the Great Battle had been cross-referenced to the registration records they had. How he would now be facing charges of endangering wizards through his actions, and that he had been formally reprimanded that afternoon before being escorted back to the cottage by Kingsley Shacklebolt. But you apparated just now, Cecilia said when Remus had returned to focusing on the chimney breast wallpaper. That's all you've ever done. And the forest was deemed a secure area for known werewolves to dash. The code has been amended. Remus snapped. Though not at her, its unexpected tone made Cecilia start. But apparitions by werewolves. They've never been allowed. Remus's voice became softer as he spoke, as if fighting the urge to tell her and fighting the urge not to. I just forgot to remember not to apparat or disapparat these last few months here. The worst was having to tell Dumbledore that I'd forgotten, which meant dash. Which means you can't continue with whatever task he'd given you. Cecilia read the remainder of the sentence from Remus's features, which he was unable to prevent from betraying him. So you might as well pack up your bags and we can owl Snape together to take you back to Hogwarts, seeing as that's why he was here, he added bitterly, turning away from Cecilia once more. Resisting the urge to withdraw her hand and incite an argument, Cecilia closed her hand more firmly around his before uttering quietly, even if you or I would no more go with him than you would. And then her Remus returned, back from temporary leave, ousting the stand-in as quickly as he had been posted. He got to his feet and pulled Cecilia with him, holding her tightly in his arms before kissing the top of her head. It's still the wrong time, he said to her agony parting. Some months are worse than others. One more night and it'll be out of my system. You had every right to be upset, replied Cecilia to his second-best shirt, huffing her breath onto the copper buttons. You didn't know Severus was going to be here, especially after a formal reprimand. She trailed off as Remus pushed her back a little, holding onto her waist as he looked at her questioning expression. I never asked you, he said, looking at her intently. All this time, and I never thought to even ask you. Ask me? we could go to live in Mole World," he continued, a beam of light lancing its way daringly through his disheartened expression. "Especially now," Remus broke off. He had no choice. Cecilia had pressed her lips against his own and had prevented him from the liberty of speech. "That's running away," she said firmly as she broke off from her one-woman invasion. "Whatever comes of this reprimand, I'll be with you. We'll be facing it together." She felt Remus's response more than saw it. Behind her hands that were entwined round his back, his sigh of obvious relief washed like a wave and Cecilia hugged him closer. They stood together in each other's embrace for a while before Remus's quietly breathed words drifted past her ear. "You're wonderful. Have you had anything to eat?" Cecilia asked his chest again. She felt his head shake across the top of her head. "In that case," she continued, leaning backwards and looking at him, "I'll make something and then why not flew Sirius and talk to him? I've got some work to be getting on with, and he's bound to be able to give you better advice than me." A fleeting look of uncertainty passed across Remus's features before he retaliated for her earlier daring attack on his primeval senses. Kissing her on the forehead, he loosened his grip, following her into the kitchen. "Your work, is that something to do with what Snape was talking to you about?" He sat down at the small table in the kitchen as Cecilia scrutinized the shelves as she sought inspiration for supper. "Yes," she nodded, smiling at her lover. "The potion, mainly. How does an omelette sound?" Following their supper of mushroom and cheese omelette, salad and finishing with banana surprise, the surprise was that the banana was the only ingredient, Cecilia took herself off to their bedroom. Downstairs she heard Remus putting away the kitchen utensils and crockery which she suspected, despite his protests that he liked doing it the Mole way he had done by magic, and she waited to pick up her notebook until she heard the interconnecting kitchen-living room door close with its familiar click. Trying not to speculate on whether Remus had taken up her suggestion to flew Sirius, Cecilia propped herself up on a linen-encased pillow, bending her knees and propping the book of notes, both legitimate and illicit, upon them, scanning through the information within as her hitherto dormant thoughts began to spring back to life, like a jack being released from its box. All the things she, Cecilia Jane Frobisher, must do. She had to find a way through. She must find a way to ensure Harry's potion worked, using their new theory as a key. She must make sure Remus was content, and that he didn't follow through his idea of abandoning the wizard world because of a misguided belief that she would abandon him to Snape. She must make a stand to those around them if anything came of this ministry. She must make sure Sirius believed her idea of curing Remus was only a hypothesis and that any hope she held of the notes in her possession leading her to the right answer she kept to herself. She must find out more. Find out more. Cecilia flicked through her notebook again, through the random collection of parchment and paper, written by many people at many different times for many different reasons. The pages therein had never meant to be lying next to one another. Yet they were accumulated for so many different reasons. And now, above all of this, the only way out of the quagmire of dead ends and false trails was to answer the unanswered questions. Tearing out a piece of paper, Cecilia picked up a pen from off her bedside table, flicking on the lamp that was beside it so its light would better illuminate the page's empty whiteness. If she were to find out the answers to her questions, she needed a person who had access to Hogwarts library, someone who had reason to be in them searching for information at this time of year. Someone to whom the page of open-ended general questions would not be seen as an obstacle and at the same time her entire meaning would be understood. To whom Cecilia would receive a response in an equally eloquent manner. Someone who, Cecilia added, scorning herself a little as she thought the words, owed her. Gripping the biro more firmly, Cecilia cast her gaze across the vastness of the empty page, beguiling her to commit something to its indelible heritage, tempting her to bare her soul upon it where the words would herald long after she was gone. With great restraint Cecilia restricted herself to wizard powers, their strength, range and onset. Permanent afflictions of wizards and muggles, lycanthropy. Effects of an unforgivable curse. A witch's view of science in the context of magic. The soul. After each sentence, Cecilia left a line, as if it were a list, before adding the word Horcrux at the end of the last one. Another sentence she added, explaining her information famine, before posing 3 more chemistry-related questions at the bottom of the page. One more sentence asking the recipient to reveal the information to no one, and Cecilia had finished, before folding the now sullied page into 3. With a slightly guilty heart, Cecilia stowed the letter inside her cardigan pocket that she had hung on the back of the bedroom door, before returning to bed. Her mind rested on Remus's eventual habitation of the bed next to her, and, as she heard the cuckoo clock cuckoo 6, she pulled her notes once more onto her angled lap, allowing its corners to nestle into the folds of the handmade quilt as she heard a familiar whoosh of Floo powder igniting in a hearth just below her. Inside the cardigan pocket the name Hermione Granger left a brief ink stain on the garment's pale blue fibers. 88,888,888. 2 brooms circling the skies above Hogwarts Castle in the late evening sunshine signaled to Hagrid that wizards were approaching. From his vantage point on the viaduct that joined the rocky outcrop before the owlery and the castle's east wing, he speculated on which wizards would be arriving by broom at such an hour. The students were set for return, he knew, in 2 days' time, but to his knowledge all of the teaching staff had already returned. Making for the outside steps that curled round the east tower, Hagrid descended awkwardly, his bulk making him land on his feet heavily as he made his way to the secret entrance to Dumbledore's office. One tap of his fist against 2 of the large sandstone blocks, pause, another 2 taps each, and then a kick just below the last step of the staircase, and doorway appeared. Hagrid stepped through quickly, tucking his beard away from the diminishing entrance. He'd made that mistake before, and then up the steps that technically should have been the foot-thick walls of the tower themselves. At the top of the stairs he repeated the pattern that had allowed him access below before stepping into Dumbledore's office. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, not looking up from the parchment that he was reading. "And how may I be of assistance to you?" "Professor Dumbledore, sir," panted Hagrid, whose hitherto mentioned journey had become somewhat more challenging for the elderly gamekeeper of late. "Brooms. Unknown visitors." "You don't think," at the headmaster's raised hand, Hagrid broke off. "Relax, Hagrid. It's only the Ministry," said Dumbledore serenely. "Only the Ministry? Only the Ministry?" exclaimed Hagrid in bewilderment. "Begging your pardon, but how can you say that after yesterday?" This time Hagrid's voice trailed off and he stood on one of Dumbledore's best rugs, the remnants of Fang's dinner seeping disgustingly from one of his pockets before recoloring the paler fibers in a dark claret. He had enough grace to look embarrassed. "The Ministry have seen fit to appoint a Mole Studies teacher and an inspector to ensure my running of the school is appropriate. I expect that they are the wizards aloft at the moment, although I am certain that they will be alighting and making their way up here in order to tell me that they will be at the staff meeting tomorrow." "An inspector?" asked Hagrid, stepping over the dubious leakage that had stopped oozing now, leaving a footprint on the rug. "You don't mean to tell me that after all these years they don't think you're running the place properly?" Dumbledore looked at Hagrid again, conveying in a single look that he was indeed correct about the Ministry's motivations. "They believe that Mrs. Frobisher's presence was a gross misjudgment on my part, and the subsequent battle that was perpetrated just outside school grounds was a situation that endangered the students. I am not, as I expected I would be, removed from the school, and it must be seen as a blessing that the Ministry are involved with the teaching of children. Now if you'll excuse me, Hagrid," concluded Dumbledore, rising from his chair and crossing over to Pet Fawkes, tickling him about the comb, "I had better find Under Secretary Umbridge and Miss Benright and welcome them warmly to the school." He nodded to an immobile Hagrid, who was still standing on his misdemeanor, blushing red in embarrassment. Thank you for thinking to inform me of possible intruders, Hagrid. And as for the blood, I know of a few charms that will eradicate it from an Alibaba Persian carpet. One swift fly around the castle and it'll be as good as old. Dumbledore was indeed correct that Umbridge and Tabitha Penright were the Ministry officials who had been circling around one of the taller towers of the castle. However, he was entirely mistaken in his assumption that they were on their way to see him. Indeed, Umbridge told Tabitha when they finally descended into the courtyard adjacent to the entrance of the Great Hall, the very last person they would be looking for was Dumbledore, as the curriculum of the school was no longer in his hands. Furthermore, Umbridge continued as a house elf came to collect their brooms and travel cases. Their audit of the school that they were to undertake that evening was not Dumbledore's concern, though they would probably endeavour to meet him tomorrow, out of courtesy, before they attended the staff meeting. Looking furtively round at the surroundings, Tabitha said nothing on the subject and followed her boss apprehensively, who was now making her way towards the teaching rooms. It was bad enough that she'd agreed to come and teach here in the first place and not been brave enough to have said no to Umbridge, as Vincento had told her she ought to have done, but now she had let her boss bring her back here, to Hogwarts, now with an impending staff meeting to have to attend. Taking the clipboard that Dolores Umbridge was waving in her direction and glancing down at the long list, Tabitha shuddered at the thought before following her boss apprehensively into the Transfiguration classroom. Ordinarily Tabitha would have delighted in the beautiful journey that she had undertaken with Dolores Umbridge, skimming the clouds joyfully as they left London and flew north, through the beautiful weather. High pressure promising the endurance of summer as the fragrant fields below them shed their perfumes which soared through the troposphere and surrounded them gloriously. She would have appreciated the fresh air, and exhilaration would have filled her with the happiness, the joy that she used to feel on days like these, which were the backdrop to her memories of family days out, when her father was still alive. When they would drive out into the Kent countryside with a picnic that her mother had made when she and her brother were younger, and they would go off together playing for hours and hours. When she had not known all about her magical abilities. When she was a normal person. Before her letter. That she was flying towards the destination which was only a name on a piece of yellowing paper all those years ago, where Tabitha's woes, mere events in the future at the moment that she read the words on the page in blissful ignorance, were withheld cruelly by blue skies and green woodland trees that were her backdrop then. And not only had Tabitha Penright's discomfort not abated, but they had increased the following day as she sat in the staff room at the end of the teachers' quarters, feeling the stares of the witches and wizards present boring into her face as she listened to Umbridge outline the involvement of the Ministry. From the expressions on the faces of the staff before her, it must have been plain to Umbridge that, other than the precursory letters that Dolores had sent beforehand, the Hogwarts professors were ignorant of the impending change in proceedings when the school returned. They had met one or two of them as they had done their rounds the previous evening before happening upon Minerva McGonagall, who had insisted they visit the headmaster once Dolores had told her why they were there. Dumbledore had been most courteous to both of them, escorting them to the Great Hall and instructing the same house elf who had taken their brooms to bring them supper and make up 2 beds in the teachers' quarters. But instead of feeling reassured that they were being welcomed so graciously, something Umbridge had endeavoured to convey to her retiring to bed, Tabitha was feeling increasingly insecure and apprehensive at returning to her old school. Silently she tried to ignore the knot of tension in her stomach as some of her old teachers, who were to be Tabitha's near-future colleagues, glanced between her and Umbridge as her boss addressed them, and instead she listened intently to Dolores as she outlined the curriculum that would be taught by each of the teachers, handed out the weighty documents that detailed the finer points that should be covered, and listed the main points of the observations and performance management that she would undertake in just over a month's time. "So, you are here to spy on us then?" declared Professor Sprout, looking sharply over the large tomes that were heading in the direction of each teacher in turn and poking a podgy finger towards Umbridge, who was standing in the center of the circle of teachers. "You are here to check up on our teaching. Tabitha watched Dolores Umbridge smile in the herbology teacher's direction, and the soon-to-be moral studies teacher felt her cheeks begin to flush red as her boss nodded slowly. Dolores had spoken of her unwritten mandate, which was to check for malpractice and the eradication of any teaching that the ministry deemed to compromise the new security measures. That, Tabitha had taken to meant the realm of non-magic, moles. "Why, of course," she replied, to the now silent staff, and Tabitha felt like she was watching a crash happen in slow motion before her very eyes. "The ministry needs to be satisfied that your headmaster does not permit a repetition of these disgraceful happenings that occurred upon these very grounds." Umbridge gripped her parchment that now contained details of the teaching classrooms which she and Tabitha had compiled the evening before, and the new officer for standards in education looked at the headmaster of Hogwarts. As a wizard, so did the teaching body. Tabitha, however, had now lost her nerve, and she focused intently on Umbridge's long list of discovered misdemeanors that were unfurling still further onto the red velvet carpet. "Think of me as a critical friend, Dumbledore," Dolores Umbridge continued, before casting her narrowing eyes across the wizarding teaching staff again. "In the same way that I now answer to Minister Fudge, you, through me, also answer to him." "Preposterous," declared Professor Flitwick, his voice originating from knee height. "I have worked in this school for nearly 50 years, and not once have I ever had to answer to the ministry." Tabitha glanced at the diminutive charms teacher, his face glowing red with fury, and it appeared that he had voiced what many of the other teachers were also thinking. "Calm yourself, Phileas," said Dumbledore softly, but before he could continue with a diplomatic pacification, Umbridge had already picked out what Tabitha knew to be the misdemeanors that they had discovered in the charms classroom. "So you are claiming that your teaching of a veiling charm designed to protect moles from impending attack is acceptable, do you?" Umbridge stabbed at the parchment that she had allowed to unfurl onto the floor, looking over her pink-framed spectacles. "I do not recall this charm being ministry approved." Flitwick's face continued to glow red but in embarrassment now, and he sat silently and lost for words before them all. "Experimental magic, unapproved magic," Umbridge muttered as she continued to work her way down the list. "It would seem that Miss Penright and I have got here just in time. From an audit of your facilities yesterday evening, Dumbledore, we discovered over 50 counts of indiscretions. Such teaching in the future would deem any lessons that your staff would deliver to the students of this school unacceptable. What do you have to say?"